So if you're in the market for one of these Nikon DX cameras, I think the 35mm 1.8 is one of the lenses that you should totally get with your camera. What I often recommend for people is to start off with one of the thrifty 50s on other formats, and I've got a slightly more expensive one on my fancier Nikon camera here. I've got a 1.4 50mm. And what I like about these very wide aperture lenses is that you can learn a lot about exposure and depth of field when you have a lens that can open up this wide. And let me show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to pull up an image here from my computer of a picture of a tree that I took a little bit earlier. And you can see just how blurry the background is here and how relatively sharp the tree trunk is. This is just a picture I took just really quickly a few minutes ago. So normally I would probably spend a little bit more time making this picture look a little better, maybe try to get a little bit more sharpness on the tree itself. But this gives you a good idea of the concept. And this, as you can see here, was shot at that 1.8 aperture. Now check this out. We're going to take a look at that same tree shot at a different aperture. So this was shot at a 7.1 aperture, and you can see, although we've got some blurriness in the background here, it's nowhere near as blurry as the 1.8, and that's because this lens with that 1.8 wide aperture will deliver a very shallow depth of field. So the things in front of you that are in focus are very sharp and focused, and the things in the background blur out. And this lens is not a zoom lens, so you have to walk with your feet or zoom with your feet to get everything into the frame there, but it really is a great way to learn. And another thing you can do with it is, let me switch over to my 2-up view here, is take pictures in very low light. So what I've got right now, let me just make some adjustments here. What I've got now is basically my little couch over there, and I've got the lens opened up at 1.8. It's actually quite dark in that section of the room, so this is actually pretty bright versus what I see with my eyes. Now, if you look on the bottom of the image there, you're going to see an F and then a 1.8, and that is because we have this lens set at its 1.8 aperture. One thing I did on my camera here was put it into what's called aperture priority mode, and this is a quasi-automatic mode. What it does is it locks the aperture in at the setting you want it at. So for a really blurry background or a super dark room or something, you're going to want to leave it at 1.8 to get the most amount of light into your camera, because the lens's aperture is opened at the widest point here. Let me just move this out of the way real quick. Now there's a number that you see fluctuating there to the left of the F, and that's the shutter speed. And you can note here that right now, if I were to take a picture, it's at 13, and we probably want to be above 60 at least, just to get the most sharp image we can. Because when you have your shutter open for too long, any little hand movement's going to get picked up in the picture. Now I can't adjust the aperture any lower, but what I can do is bring up the sensitivity of the sensor. And I'm going to hold down my ISO button here on the back and then turn the dial here on the back of the camera to increase the sensitivity of the camera. And as I do that, you can see that our shutter speed is increasing. Now you do increase the amount of noise you see in the photograph when you bump up the ISO. You're going to have more graininess to it. But in many cases, I have found that I can take a picture in a relatively dark room and get a good picture without a flash, just by attaching my widest aperture lens that I have and adjusting the ISO to a point where I can get a shutter speed that won't pick up too much hand movement for a nice sharp photo. So that is another nice advantage of this, is that you can take pictures in pretty dark environments because you're letting in so much light. And these modern SLRs have great sensors for low light conditions. And by comparison, if you have one of these kit lenses on your camera, which are perfectly fine, you do have a great focal range on this. You can zoom from 18 to 200 millimeters on this one, for example. You'll notice, though, that the aperture is not nearly as wide. This one starts at 3.5 at its lowest setting, and that's only when you're at the 18 millimeter mark here. But if you're zoomed in all the way, or even partially, the aperture actually changes to the point where your minimum at 200 is 5.6. So this will do much more poorly in low light on the same camera versus a 1.8 lens that I have attached to this one. So there's a good reason for having one of these in your camera bag. You can't zoom it in, there's no zoom on it, so you have to, again, walk closer to people, but you have so much more light you can bring in, and you get some really cool depth of field when you're out taking pictures like this. And this is why whenever someone asks me, what lens should I get with my camera, I recommend, if you're on a budget, go with the kit lens to have some zoom range to it, but also get one of these 1.8 or 1.4 lenses, because you will have a great experience of just getting great images out of the gate, but also learning a lot about exposure and depth of field.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Hot Sauce and Video Games, Brian Parker, Chris Allegretta, Tom Albrecht, Thomas Anfang, Jim Tanous, and Handheld Obsession. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.